Those who have any connections to the military, this is kind of like a big solemnity for us. It's one of my favorite feast days of the year. Not because of the military side, but also because it's St. Martin of Tours. He's a pretty cool guy. And there's also another thing that we celebrate today that shares a common spirit with St. Martin of Tours, which is Veterans Day, or as it was originally known as Armistice Day. I'll go into that in a second. Both call us to remember what it means to live lives of service, mercy, and unity. In the first reading from the prophet Isaiah, it says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives." We hear that in a gospel passage. That's the first time that Jesus publicly preaches, is he's quoting this section of Isaiah chapter 61. These words were lived out perfectly in Jesus in that gospel, and they also became the mission of St. Martin of Tours as well. So Martin of Tours was a soldier in the Roman army, and so in the time of the Roman Empire, if you were in the Roman army, to become a citizen of Rome, you had to do 25 years of service in the military. And so usually that meant most people didn't make it to 25 years because they probably died or got wounded or something. But one of the things that's interesting in some of the research that I did on St. Martin of Tours, he was actually a member of the Imperial Guard. So what that meant was he was actually in a prestigious group of soldiers, and their focus, their purpose was to protect the emperor and to protect the jurisdiction of Rome. And so with that gave a lot of, there were a lot of benefits, a lot of perks, and he also never, so according to legend, is he never killed anybody, because he was in this imperial guard. And so one of the things that was very unique about them is they were easily distinguished from any other kind of Roman soldier, was because they wore like almost like a maroon, a darkish, reddish purple cloak. And so that brings us to the famous story about him, where one night in the winter, he met a beggar who was shivering in the cold. And at this time, he wasn't even Christian. He was a catechumen, for that might resonate with some people who are going through OCIA at this point. He was a catechumen. And yet he was moved with compassion, and he cut his cloak in half and gave half to the other man. When he returned back to the barracks, because normally that cloak was very large, but it was meant to be used also as like a sleeping blanket. The other soldiers made fun of him for doing so. But that night he had a vision, and he saw Jesus going before the angels of heaven, showing them this cloak that he was wearing. And they're like, "Where did you get that, Jesus?" "I got it from my beloved son, Martin." Christ revealed to Martin what the Gospel of Matthew tells us today. "Whatever you did for the least of my brethren, you did for me." From that moment on, Martin's life changed. He actually petitioned to leave the army at that point, but he still had time and service to do. I can recall a lot of people who have discerned priesthood in the military, and they're like, "I want to leave," but they got to serve their time, pay their dues. But again, he made a promise never to kill anybody, and that's what happened. He left the army after he finished his 25 years. And then the first thing he wanted to do was to become a monk, to remove himself and to focus on prayer. But the people of Tours, where he's from, had other plans. They made him a priest, and then they made him a bishop because he was such a powerful figure. And as a bishop, he cared not only for city dwellers, but for the pagani, or pagans, the people in the countryside, those on the margins of society that after Christianity was put as the religion of Rome were kind of cast aside. That is why one of the things when we talk about someone who's not yet baptized, we call them pagans. And so I like to when I'm getting ready for a baptism with an infant, I'm like, oh, look at the cute little pagan. I did that once to my sister. She didn't like that. But anyway, Martin's generosity reminds us that holiness begins with mercy, with seeing Christ in those who are poor, sick, lonely, or in need. Today, the church wears red. That's normally reserved for just martyrs or special masses with the Holy Spirit, because it focuses on the Holy Spirit's fire and the blood of sacrifice. He was not a martyr in the strict sense, but his whole life was marked by the same courageous love and self-giving spirit that defines a martyr's heart. As a soldier who turned into a servant of Christ, he poured himself out for the poor and his people, living a daily martyrdom of charity. The red also resonates with Veterans Day, reminding us of those who have given their lives in service and sacrifice for others. It's a color of love that costs something, the love of Christ burning in generous hearts. Fun fact with the cloak of St. Martin. So he was heavily venerated by the French kings. And so every campaign that they went, they actually led their campaigns with the relic of his cloak. And it was carried by a priest on a banner of that severed cloak. And he was called a capiamus, which is where we get the word chaplain. And the cloak was reserved in a special building called a capella, or capella, which later translates to chapel. So his example is a reminder of us to move forward with generosity, with zeal for to accomplishing the mission. And so we are reminded of Martin because of being a soldier. We're also reminded of Armistice Day, 11/11/11. So November 11th at 11:11 a.m. was the end of World War I in 1918. It was meant to be as a sign of world peace for the rest of humanity, but obviously that has not been the case. But this Armistice Day has been set aside to honor those who have worn the uniform in service to their country. Like St. Martin, many of those who have worn the uniform began as soldiers, but then became witnesses to peace, men and women who have sacrificed something larger than themselves. They remind us that freedom, like faith, comes at a cost, and that service, when done in love, becomes a reflection of God's own self-gift. We can honor those who have gone before us and St. Martin, not only by our words, but by the lives we lead, by practicing the corporal and spiritual works of mercy like St. Martin, by building unity where the world wants division, and by protecting the dignity of every person, especially those who are poor and forgotten. St. Martin's simple act of compassion, sharing of his cloak, became a sign of unity. The soldier and the beggar covered by the same garment, both warmed by God's love. So let's ask the intercession of St. Martin of Tours today, that we may imitate him as servants of mercies and builders of unity, that our faith may heal the brokenhearted, lift up the poor, and bring Christ's warmth wherever the world has grown cold.